We promised each other full honesty before saying I do. I thought vulnerability meant strength, not judgment. I thought if he really loved me, my past wouldn't define his future. Everyone keeps acting like I deliberately sabotaged my own wedding by revealing information that was designed to hurt or shock my fiancé. But they have no idea what actually led to that moment or why my answer felt so natural and appropriate given everything James and I had built our entire relationship around: complete transparency, radical honesty, and the belief that true love meant accepting your partner's full history without judgment or conditions. It was our joint pre-wedding brunch, held at the beautiful garden restaurant we'd chosen for its intimate atmosphere and perfect Instagram lighting. The event was exactly what we'd envisioned when we'd started planning our wedding festivities. Close friends and family from both sides, flowing mimosas, gorgeous floral arrangements, and that perfect mix of celebration and anticipation that makes pre-wedding gatherings feel so magical and meaningful. I was wearing the white sundress I'd bought specifically for this occasion, feeling radiant and loved as I moved between tables of people who were genuinely excited to celebrate our upcoming marriage. James looked handsome and relaxed in his navy blazer, charming everyone with stories about our relationship and expressing gratitude for all the support our families had shown throughout our engagement. The entire morning had been perfect, exactly the kind of intimate, joyful celebration that would create beautiful memories to treasure for years to come. Our photographer was capturing candid moments of laughter and affection. Our families were bonding over shared excitement about the wedding, and James and I were basking in the warmth of being surrounded by people who truly loved and supported our union. That's when James suggested we have one of our signature moments of radical honesty that had become such an important part of our relationship dynamic throughout our 2 years together. He pulled me aside to a quiet corner of the restaurant's garden, away from the chattering guests and clinking glasses, and suggested we use this special moment to share one final deep truth with each other before officially becoming husband and wife. The following week, the suggestion felt perfectly in keeping with the values and communication style that had made our relationship so strong and meaningful. From our very first dates, James had emphasized the importance of complete transparency between partners, sharing his belief that most relationships failed because people weren't brave enough to be fully honest with each other about their histories, feelings, and expectations. He'd told me repeatedly that he wanted to know everything about me, not just the pretty, socially acceptable parts of my story, but the complicated, messy, real parts that most people tried to hide from their romantic partners. This radical honesty had become one of the things I loved most about our connection, the way we could share anything without fear of judgment or rejection. So when James looked at me with that serious but loving expression and asked for one more moment of complete truth, I felt honored that he was creating space for us to be vulnerable together on such an important day. He asked me directly about my body count, framing it as wanting to know this one final detail so we could enter marriage with absolutely no secrets between us. He emphasized that there would be no judgment, that he just wanted to know who I was as a complete person, rather than wondering about aspects of my past that I might have kept private. The question felt like the natural culmination of months of conversations we'd had about honesty, authenticity, and the importance of accepting your partner's full history as part of loving them completely. James had consistently presented himself as someone who was secure enough to handle any truth, someone who valued transparency over comfort. I hesitated for just a moment, not because I was ashamed of my answer, but because I wanted to make sure this was really the right time and place for this level of intimate disclosure. We were surrounded by family and friends, in the middle of a celebration, just days before our wedding. But James's expression was so earnest and loving, so clearly coming from a place of wanting to deepen our connection rather than create problems, that I decided to honor his request for complete honesty. I told him the number was 79, saying it quietly and with the kind of vulnerable honesty that had always strengthened our relationship in the past. James's reaction was completely calm and supportive. He nodded, thanked me for my honesty, and pulled me close for a kiss that felt like acceptance and unconditional love. For the rest of the brunch, he was his normal, charming, affectionate self, giving me no indication that my answer had bothered him or created any kind of problem between us. It wasn't until later that evening that I realized something had gone terribly wrong. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came when James stepped away from the brunch to take a phone call and never returned to the celebration. I'd been mingling with guests, accepting congratulations and excitement about our upcoming wedding, assuming he was just handling some last-minute wedding logistics or family business that required his attention. But as the afternoon wore on and James remained absent, I started to feel concerned about where he'd gone and why he wasn't participating in what was supposed to be our shared celebration. When I asked his best man if he knew where James had disappeared to, I got a strange look and a vague response about James needing to handle something important. By evening, when James still hadn't returned home to our shared apartment, I was genuinely worried about his well-being and starting to call his phone repeatedly to make sure he was okay. Every call went straight to voicemail, every text remained unread, and I was beginning to panic about whether he'd been in an accident or encountered some kind of emergency. That's when my phone started exploding with notifications that made me realize the situation was much worse than a simple miscommunication or scheduling conflict. I was getting messages, calls, and social media notifications from people I hadn't spoken to in years, college friends, old hookups, even acquaintances from high school who had somehow learned intimate details about my sexual history and were reaching out with everything from shock to judgment to curiosity about my upcoming wedding. The messages revealed that James had somehow shared information about our private conversation with multiple people, who had then spread that information throughout various social networks until it reached people from every phase of my romantic and sexual history. But it wasn't just the number 79 that was being discussed. Somehow, detailed information about specific encounters, relationships, and experiences from throughout my adult life was being shared and analyzed by people who had no business knowing anything about my private, intimate history. Screenshots of old text messages, photos from parties I'd forgotten about, stories about encounters I'd assumed would remain private forever. All of it was suddenly circulating through group chats, social media platforms, and word-of-mouth networks that connected people from every area of my life. I felt completely violated and exposed in ways I'd never experienced before. The most intimate and private aspects of my sexual history were being treated as entertainment and gossip by people who barely knew me, while James, the person who was supposed to protect my vulnerability and honor my trust, had apparently been the source of this massive betrayal. The humiliation was compounded by the timing. We were supposed to be getting married in less than a week, and instead, I was being publicly shamed and judged by hundreds of people who now saw me as some kind of spectacle, rather than a woman who was about to become someone's wife. But the worst part was that James was nowhere to be found to explain what had happened or why he'd chosen to share the most private information I'd ever trusted him with. As the nightmare of that evening unfolded, and I tried to understand how my moment of vulnerability had turned into public humiliation, I started thinking back through our entire relationship and the foundation of radical honesty that had apparently been built on much shakier ground than I'd ever realized. When I'd met James 2 years earlier, I'd been in what I called my clean slate phase, a period when I'd decided to stop the casual dating and random hookups that had characterized my 20s and focus on finding someone I could build something real and lasting with. My past had been extensive and varied, involving everything from serious relationships that lasted several months to one-night stands that happened during periods when I was prioritizing fun and exploration over commitment and stability. I wasn't ashamed of my choices, but I was ready to channel my energy toward finding a life partner rather than continuing to collect experiences. James had seemed like the perfect person to build that kind of future with. He was stable, successful, emotionally mature, and genuinely interested in getting to know me as a complete person rather than just the version of myself that existed within our relationship. What had particularly attracted me to James was his apparent comfort with my sexual experience and his stated appreciation for women who'd lived full lives before settling down. He'd told me repeatedly that he found my confidence and lack of shame about my past refreshing, that he preferred dating someone who knew what she wanted, rather than someone who was still figuring out her sexuality and preferences. He'd specifically said that he didn't care about my past as long as it had brought me to him, and that my experiences had probably made me a better partner because I could appreciate what we had together, instead of wondering what I might be missing. These conversations had felt incredibly validating and had convinced me that James was the kind of evolved, secure man who could love me completely without being threatened by my history or trying to shame me for choices I'd made before we even met. Throughout our relationship, James had consistently asked for more transparency and honesty about my past relationships and sexual experiences. When I'd initially been cautious about sharing details, he'd encouraged me to be more open, assuring me that he was secure enough to handle whatever information I might share. He'd positioned this desire for complete transparency as evidence of his emotional maturity and his commitment to building a relationship based on truth rather than comfortable illusions. He'd told me about his ex-girlfriend who'd cheated on him and explained that dishonesty and secrecy were much bigger problems for him than any truth could ever be. So, over the course of our 2 years together, I'd gradually become more and more open about my romantic and sexual history, sharing stories and details that helped him understand who I was as a complete person rather than just the sanitized version of myself that I might have presented in a less honest relationship. James had always seemed genuinely interested in and comfortable with these revelations, never expressing jealousy or judgment about my past experiences, always positioning himself as someone who valued authenticity over comfort. But apparently, there had been a significant difference between his theoretical appreciation for my sexual experience and his practical ability to handle the full scope of what that experience actually entailed. The number 79 had crossed some line in his mind between experienced woman and something else entirely. Something that made me seem unsuitable as a wife, something that needed to be shared and discussed with other people rather than accepted and honored as the private truth I'd trusted him with. The morning after the brunch disaster, I woke up hoping that the previous evening had been some kind of nightmare or misunderstanding that could be resolved through honest conversation and mutual commitment to working through whatever problems had emerged. Instead, I received a phone call from our wedding venue informing me that our reservation had been cancelled by the groom, effective immediately, with no refund possible due to the timing and the contractual agreements we'd signed months earlier. The conversation was surreal and humiliating. The venue coordinator, who'd been working with us for months and had seemed genuinely excited about our celebration, was clearly uncomfortable delivering this information and kept apologizing while explaining that James had called early that morning to cancel everything. When I tried to explain that there had been some kind of misunderstanding, that I needed to speak with James directly before any decisions were made about our wedding, the coordinator gently informed me that James had been very clear about his decision and had specifically requested that all future communication about the event be directed to him rather than to me. The realization that James had not only disappeared from my life, but had also taken control of cancelling our wedding without any discussion or explanation was devastating in ways I'd never experienced before. This wasn't just a fight that we could work through. This was James systematically dismantling our entire future together without giving me any opportunity to understand what had happened or attempt to repair whatever damage had been done. But the venue cancellation was just the beginning of a day filled with one humiliation after another. Throughout the morning, I received similar calls from our photographer, caterer, florist, and various other vendors who'd been hired for our wedding celebration. In every case, James had contacted them directly to cancel our services, leaving me to deal with the financial and logistical aftermath of decisions I'd had no part in making. The financial impact was staggering. We'd already invested over $35,000 in wedding preparations, most of which was non-refundable due to the timing of the cancellations. My custom wedding dress, the engagement party deposits, the honeymoon reservations, all of it was suddenly worthless, money that had been spent on a future that no longer existed. Even worse than the financial losses was the social humiliation that continued to unfold throughout the day, as more and more people learned about our cancelled wedding and the circumstances that had led to James's decision to end our engagement. My bridesmaids, who had been so excited about our celebration and had invested their own time and money in dresses, travel arrangements, and pre-wedding festivities, started reaching out with confused and increasingly distant messages about what had happened and whether our friendship would be affected by whatever drama had emerged between James and me. Some of them were supportive and concerned about my well-being, but others seemed uncomfortable being associated with someone whose sexual history had become public knowledge and whose wedding had been cancelled under such dramatic and embarrassing circumstances. The most painful responses came from James's family members, who had welcomed me warmly throughout our engagement and had seemed genuinely excited about having me as part of their family. Several of them reached out with messages that ranged from confused to sympathetic to subtly judgmental about whatever had caused James to make such a dramatic decision so close to our wedding date. But the worst part of the entire nightmare was that James remained completely unreachable, refusing to answer calls or respond to messages, leaving me to handle all the practical and emotional aftermath of our cancelled wedding without any explanation or opportunity for closure. 3 days after the brunch that destroyed my life, I finally received the communication I'd been desperately waiting for, though it wasn't the explanation or opportunity for reconciliation I'd been hoping for during those endless days of uncertainty and public humiliation. James sent a single text message that was both an explanation and a final goodbye, making it clear that our relationship was over and that there would be no further communication between us. The message was brief but devastating. "You were honest. I just didn't know it would feel this cold." Those words hit me harder than pages of angry accusations or detailed explanations of his feelings would have. James wasn't saying that I'd lied to him or betrayed his trust by being dishonest about my past. He was saying that my honesty had revealed something about who I was that made him unable to continue loving me or building a future with me. The coldness he was referring to wasn't just about the number 79. It was about my casual attitude towards sharing that information, my apparent comfort with having had such extensive sexual experience, my lack of shame or regret about choices that he now saw as incompatible with the kind of wife and partner he wanted. From James's perspective, my honest answer had revealed that I was someone who treated sex and intimate relationships differently than he did, someone whose values around sexuality and commitment were fundamentally incompatible with his vision of marriage and exclusive partnership. The fact that he'd shared our private conversation with others wasn't just revenge or an attempt to humiliate me. It was his way of processing the shock and disappointment of discovering that the woman he'd planned to marry had a sexual history that made him question everything he thought he knew about my character and suitability as a life partner. Reading that final text message forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about what my casual attitude toward my sexual history had really communicated to someone who was looking for a partner who shared his more traditional values around intimacy and commitment. While I'd been proud of my honesty and authenticity, James had been looking for someone whose past experiences would make her more appreciative of exclusive commitment rather than someone who seemed comfortable with the kind of extensive sexual experimentation that had characterized my 20s. My number of 79 hadn't just been a statistic. It had been evidence of a lifestyle and approach to relationships that suggested I might not be capable of the kind of exclusive devotion and commitment that marriage requires. The elaborate wedding we'd been planning, the future we'd been building, the love I'd thought we shared, all of it had been based on James's incomplete understanding of who I was as a person and what my approach to sexuality and relationships really meant about my capacity for exclusive commitment. My moment of radical honesty had revealed incompatibilities that couldn't be overcome through better communication or increased understanding. Some truths are too fundamental to work around, and some revelations change everything about how your partner sees you and your relationship. The empty apartment, the cancelled wedding dress hanging in my closet, the deposits that would never be refunded, they were all evidence of how complete honesty had destroyed the most important relationship of my life by revealing truths that James couldn't accept or integrate into his vision of our future together. I'd thought vulnerability meant strength, but apparently, vulnerability can also mean revealing aspects of yourself that make you incompatible with someone's deepest values and expectations. James had asked for honesty, and I'd given him the truth, but the truth had been cold in ways that made our love feel impossible to sustain, and now we both had to live with the consequences of learning who we really were when all the comfortable illusions were stripped away. Some relationships can't survive complete transparency, and some love isn't strong enough to overcome fundamental differences in values and life experiences. I'd been honest about who I was, and James had been honest about his inability to accept that truth. In the end, we'd both gotten exactly what we'd asked for, and it had destroyed everything we'd thought we were building together.